So, looking now at Act 4, Scene 2 of King Lear for the AQA Paper 1, English Literature Tragedy paper, we're now looking at a kind of interlude almost. Really interesting scene. It did appear on the 2019 paper, lines 28 to 72. We'll have a look at the whole scene, a bit long for the section, but a really key scene. What we see here, principally, the essence of the action of the scene, is an argument between Albany and Goneril. Well, it never really gets to any serious discussion of anything. It's just a kind of trading of insults, in which what we see is a kind of turning point in this play for Albany, who doesn't have a massive trajectory. You know, he's not in it that much. But he was mentioned in the very first lines of the play as being sort of in some way in opposition to Cornwall, and that is hinted at later in the play as well, when it's mentioned that, have you heard, Curran says to Edmund, have you heard about disputes between Albany and Cornwall? And so Shakespeare's sown the seeds for this scene, in which Albany, who's had his doubts right from Act 1 when he saw Lear leave Goneril's and his palace without really understanding why. Now we see him confront Goneril and her behaviour towards her father, and to basically dissociate himself from her actions. But what he doesn't do is entirely shift to Lear's side, because he feels that it's his duty to protect Britain from a potential French invasion. So there's this strange kind of in-between element for Albany's character, where he stays on the side of the bad guys, although he's very uncomfortable with that, and then quickly shifts to turn on Edmund at the end. This is his scene, though, really, where he opposes Goneril. So positioning the scene, we've just seen Gloucester, you know, the victim really of Goneril's idea, pluck out his eyes, in quite a state with his son. We've seen all the good characters really suffering, and we've seen all the bad characters thrive. We might have seen a few visual hints, and we see in this scene a very obvious hint that Edmund and Goneril are lovers. So that comes out of the woodwork really in this scene at the beginning. And then we're setting up the ending of the play, where Albany is going to be alongside Edgar. First of all, the only survivor. Those two are the only survivors. Albany is the only one, except Edgar, to survive. But plus, before that, as everything unfolds in Act 5, Albany is part of that sort of voice of justice that Edgar also likes to portray himself as. So let's have a look anyway at the scene. So if we see, that was the end of the previous scene, the beginning of scene 2 here, we see it's Goneril and Edmund on their own for a little moment. They don't have much of this. Oswald interrupts them anyway here. Perhaps, and that might be perhaps a little comical in some ways, the way in which perhaps they are after a moment of intimacy together, and then Oswald stumbles into it, who's always kind of got his eye on trying to some sort of intimacy with his mistress Goneril, but never gets anywhere with that. She's never really interested in him, but likes to use his loyalty for her advantage. She's heading towards her own palace and Albany's palace, and she says, her first lines are, I marvel that our mild husband has not met us on the way. Mild husband is the first beginnings of this whole scene of separating Goneril's fierceness and ferocious nature from what she calls Albany's mildness, but what we might call his reasonableness. However, Oswald comes in, and he reports, and again it's something that Shakespeare does throughout the play, of giving us little pre-warnings of what's going to happen, with Oswald and Goneril in Act 1 sort of discussing what they're going to do to wind up Lear, and with the gentleman telling Kent what Lear was doing on the heath, shouting at the storm. Here we hear that we hear what Albany has said to Oswald, as he's said that Goneril's on her way, or the worst was his answer. And when he hears about Gloucester's, what they're calling treachery, he called me sot. Again, the viciousness of the language coming in on a very casual basis, but there's always sort of hard, violent language there. And told me I'd turned the wrong side out. Well, the whole world has turned the wrong side out in this play. So on a little micro level, the language is always reflecting that things are upside down and turbulent. What he should dislike seem pleasant to him, what like offensive. Now that's from their point of view, from the evil point of view. From our point of view, he's making the right decisions. But it just again gives us this sense of dislocation and disorientation. Everything's a bit upside down. She then does turn to Edmund and says, don't come any further. She calls him, she's speaking of Albany as the cowish terror of his spirit. So she says you don't have to be frightened of him, really, is what she's suggesting. But nonetheless, she doesn't want to have Edmund mingled in what's going to follow, which is going to be a rather unseemly argument, presumably. So she sends Edmund back to what she says, my brother Cornwall. She doesn't realise Cornwall's dead at this stage, nor do we fully, because we've seen him being carried off, but we haven't heard what's happened to him. And they're now preparing for war. Get his conduct his powers, get ready to fight. And then she says, I must change arms at home and give the distaff into my husband's hands. The distaff was the sort of something for used in weaving, so that was the woman's role, but she's suggesting that she has to play the man at home, and that's one of the kind of, again, topsy-turvy elements of the play, perhaps. And she says, oh well, Oswald's going to carry messages between us, and so there's this intimacy here, and physically on stage we should see that, obviously, with their touching, and there's clearly that they are lovers at this point, or certainly wish to be. And she talks about a mistress's command, and she gives him something to wear, a favour. It's not clear what that might be, a scarf or a ring or something. Decline your head, this kiss, if it durst, would scratch the spirits up into the air, conceive them fairly well. So she kisses him on the head, and so it looks like the intimacy is only just beginning at this stage, but it is clear. And then Edmund comes up with one of his great lines in response. His way of being romantic is to say, yours in the ranks of death. So not a sort of Valentine's card that you ever want to receive, really, is it? But it's a brilliant summary of the kind of death obsessed, horrific nature of their relationships, that they are sort of combined in evil. And that's summarised in their sort of deadly kind of relationship, a sort of murderous compact. She calls him Gloucester, of course, because he has now taken his father's titles. And then she says the difference of man and man. My fool usurps my body. So, she's looking at Edmund as a real man, a man of power and action and glamour and sexiness, if you want to put it bluntly. Whereas Albany seems like he's too soft and gentle and nice. And again, it's Shakespeare looking ahead to trends that continue to this day, of this tendency for patriarchal culture in its toxic masculinity to create an atmosphere in which women are kind of almost hypnotized and intoxicated into believing that an attractive man should be brutal and unkind and cruel and mean and violent, and that something in that makes him sexy, and that the opposite, a gentle, considerate, reasonable man, is unsexy. that's a very poisonous idea, obviously, but it seems to have got inscribed in the culture at a fairly early stage in our Western history. Albany comes in at this point, and she makes this sort of sarcastic comment, "I have been worth the whistle." In other words, I thought I was worth a bit more than you not even bothering to come and greet me. You're not interested in me. And he turns directly on her and comes up with this very violent dismissal of her. "Oh, you are not worth the dust of the rude wind blows in your face." So a very fierce dismissal of her, saying how worthless she is to him. "I fear your disposition." And then that nature, there's nature again coming in. How natural are you? Are you an unnatural person because of the way you've treated your father? And so again, this kind of idea of the sliver and disbranch material sap, perforce must wither and come to deadly use, is this idea of the sort of tree of life and the family tree as an image of, you've turned against your own family. And so it's like some sort of deadly poison tree that you represent. Goneril can't be bothered with any of this, and she dismisses it in just, 6 words? "No more, the text is foolish. What's this story you're trying to tell me that's idiotic and stupid?" And she just flaps away any words that he might throw at her. He comes back with another long speech, and these are the first really long speeches Albany's had in the play. He's had only little snatches of speeches up to this point, but here he's really been fully determined to say his piece and to show that he really is disgusted by what he's heard about how Lear's been treated and how Gloucester's been treated. So, he says, "Wisdom and goodness seem vile to the vile," which is exactly what we saw at the start of the scene, that they were saying, Oswald was saying all these terrible things were good, and Albany was bad for not approving of them. Filth savours but themselves. Again, that could be an image of Edmund and Goneril as this sort of low-life, compacted couple. Tigers, not daughters, so the great animal imagery coming in again. You've behaved like a fierce animal, not like a reasonable human being. And he asks rhetorically, "What have you done to your father?" And he calls him gracious aged. He might be being a little bit generous to Lear, because we've seen him be very ungracious as well, of course. But again, he talks about the head lugged bare. And so that's that image of the even natural and animal creatures will behave lovingly towards their young, and there is a sort of relationship between young and old, but here she's broken that natural bond. You've madded him, so he very much seems to have seen exactly what's going on, and it's the first time really in the play that he, or maybe any other good characters, have seen exactly what the situation is. But he sees right through it, and he knows what's happened. They've driven him mad. And so he says that humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep. So again, this image, a little bit like some of the language that Lear used himself when attacking Goneril, which is interesting. But that, this is going to be a world in which everything becomes vicious and violent. Well, that is exactly the world that we're seeing in the play. An extremely vicious and violent, really kind of horrific world in which human beings will cannibalize each other. Of course, not surprisingly, Goneril does not really just calmly take this stuff. She gives as good as she gets. She calls him milk-livered man, and there's only half a line there, so there's a pause. We're not sure, what's intended there. Does he turn away? Does he come to threaten her? Does he? I don't know, but milk-livered is the idea that, he doesn't drink alcohol, he drinks milk. He's soft, he's gentle, he's mild. As she called him at the start, he's not got any oomph about him, and she finds him boring and frustrating because of that. You've got a cheek for blows and a head for wrongs. So you're ready to be hit. You're ready to find fault. Not in thy brows and I discerning thine honour from thy suffering. You don't know what's going on. You can't work out the truth. You can't tell what's honourable and what's not. Thou not knowest, fools, do those villains pity who are punished ere they have done their mischief. So again, you just don't understand. You don't know what's going on. You don't know who's a fool and who's a villain. You don't know what's mischief, and you can't recognize any of these things because you're thinking about the wrong thing. Where's your drum? In other words, why aren't you getting ready to fight? France is coming into our land. The French troops are landing in Dover. We should be getting ready to fight them, not complaining about each other. You're a moral fool, and crying, alack, why does he so? So she sees him as this very weak leader. He's supposed to be one of the leaders of Britain at this stage, and instead he's just complaining about what she thinks are petty issues instead of getting ready to defend the country against an attack by a foreign power. Albany's response, "See thyself, devil," is great, isn't it? It's all about, seeing throughout the whole play. Can you see what's going on? But see thyself is an echo of the famous Greek motto, know thyself. That was supposed to be the main thing. Know who you are, understand yourself. And that's what he's saying to her. Do you really understand who you are? And then there's but sadly there's a bit of misogyny creeps in when he says, this deformity is even worse because it's a woman. And she's a bit right to call him a vain fool there, because he seems to be subscribing to a very old-fashioned view of women who should not be forceful and angry and tough, but should be sort of weak and mild like him almost. So there's a lot that's not quite admirable there too, which is typical of Shakespeare. He doesn't allow us to side with anybody clearly. But he carries on. Changed and self-covering thing is interesting, self-covered thing. Be monster, not thy feature. For shame. So, you are turned into a monster and you are shameful, but you can't see it. He then again suggests that his hands might obey his blood. I might tear thy flesh and bones. And therefore, but you're a fiend anyway, and a woman's shape doth shield thee. So again, this idea of, I would attack you physically, but because you're a woman, I won't. And she's not very impressed by that generosity. If he thinks it's that, she says, "Marry your manhood." It says "now" there. Often in other copies, it says "mew," as if she sort of goes like a cat or something. Ooh, what a big man you are, is basically what she's saying. Oh, thank you for being so masculine and not hitting me. You would have hit me, would you? She suggested that he's too much of a coward to hit her anyway. So there's it's an unpleasant scene really when you unpick it. There's nothing to admire about Goneril, but there isn't that much to admire about Albany. He might be right in some of his complaints, but he's not right in the way that he sort of threatens her but then doesn't do anything about it, and just appears kind of rather sort of self-righteous again. So there aren't sort of many reasons to admire Albany here either, which might make us wonder at the end of the play how stable the state really will be if he's the main leader when everybody else has died. The end of the scene sees a messenger just giving the news to make sure that Goneril and Albany know what exactly has happened. They know that Gloucester has been accused of being a traitor, but they don't know that his eyes have been plucked out, and that's what the messenger says. He says it in this brilliant way. He says that the Duke of Cornwall's dead, so that's a shock. Going to put out the other eye of Gloucester, the other eye, as if everyone knows he's lost one eye, but actually he was going to get the other one. So it's a kind of almost comic way of putting it. And Albany does respond as in a human way that would expect the audience to respond to Gloucester's eyes. Oh my God, Gloucester's eyes. But notice he's more bothered by that than he is about the Cornwall's death. That's the first confirmation that Cornwall is actually dead. And the messenger explains that a servant attacked him and that's how he died. Now, what is, again, against Albany, if you like, is that his reaction to that news, that the servant killed him, is to say, this shows you are above you justices. In other words, the gods are just, which is exactly what Edgar's going to say later. Because they've speedily, punished Cornwall for his crimes. But we might sort of read that and say, well, if the gods were going to punish Cornwall for his crimes, why didn't they stop him doing it in the first place? If they are going to interfere, why interfere only afterwards when everything's, when Gloucester's suffered for no particular reason? And the messenger says, oh, I've got a letter from you, from your sister. And we get this nice little aside from Goneril there. She says, one way I like this well. What does she like? It's not clear what she means there, what exactly she likes. Does she like the news that Gloucester's eyes have been plucked out? Does she like just the news that Cornwall's dead because somehow it makes her sister suffer and she's got it in for her sister? Although she never blatantly said that before. But she immediately knows that Regan's a widow, and obviously that news is not so tart. That's a little bit worrying because she knows that means that Regan has got a chance to pursue Gloucester, and as in Edmund, whom they call Gloucester now. So that's basically the end of the scene, and what you've seen is Albany making a stand, making a little bit of a unpleasant spectacle of himself nonetheless, appearing both weak and kind of vicious at the same time. So there's usually it's played more straight than that oh, well, Albany's a goodie and he's standing up to the evil Goneril, but really when you read it carefully, that's not quite exactly what's happening. What we're seeing is a kind of belated attempt to stand up against Goneril, and done in a kind of vicious and self-righteous and rather unpleasant manner, and a sort of and a limiting view of femininity that underscores his surprise at Goneril's strength. So there's lots of things that a modern audience in particular, but I think Shakespeare himself would see in this scene and say, Albany's not as great as he thinks he is, and just as Edgar isn't either, that they kind of see themselves as the voice of justice, but they don't behave in particularly morally admirable ways in some respects, and nor do they seem particularly capable of bringing about justice very swiftly. So there's a lot that's left ambiguous here, which is something that as a production it's hard to put ambiguity on stage, because you have to make some decisions how you say lines. You have to simplify things a little bit, otherwise it can get very confusing for a live audience who don't have the chance to look back at the lines and say, what did that say? But nonetheless, as readers, we would say that there's a lot of moral ambiguity in this scene.